Γεια σας. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about anything and everything Greek. The Polytechnic Uprising is recognized every year in Greece in remembrance of the university student protesters and their supporters who were routed by Greece's military junta on November 17th, 1973, after 3 days of protests for ψωμί, παιδεία και ελευθερία, or bread, education, and freedom. The students inspired the citizens of Greece with their resistance. The sight of army tanks crashing down the central gate of the campus as students still clung to it signaled the beginning of the end for the dictatorship. The uprising and the part it played in ending the military regime is celebrated by Greek universities, public schools, educational institutes, newspapers, public officials, and the Greek people. The Greek Online School explains one of the most important days in the history of the Greek nation is, quote, the heroic uprising of the Greek youth of the Polytechnic against tyranny, dictatorship, and the general persecution of every form of freedom. First, some background information for understanding why the students rose up and what was at stake. After the incredible suffering of Greece during World War II, which we described in our September episode, The Horrific Death of Eleni Papadaki, civil war broke out between the communists, who'd fought as guerrillas during the war, and the royalists or conservatives who supported the return of the Greek monarchy. For a time, the communists were able to control northern Greece with Albanian and Yugoslavian support. The US and the UK sided with Greek government forces, the conservatives, and won the day. Many Greeks were killed. It was literally a bloody mess. Tight-fisted conservative control became the name of the game, and many Greeks continued to suffer. Obviously, the political situation in post-war Greece needs its own multi-part episode. We're just setting the stage for the uprising. Fast forward to the 1960s. In April 1967, a reformist centrist government was expected to win the Greek election, after already winning in a landslide in 1964. The United States government and the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency, were freaked out by the rise of Greek left-leaning organizations pushing back after years of right-wing oppression. And more importantly, they were freaked out by the influence of the USSR throughout the Balkans, Cold War worries. So the US government, through the CIA, aided and abetted the overthrow of the Greek government by a group of high-level colonels in the Greek army in what was known as the Colonels' Coup. Bottom line, the US worried Greece was leaning too far left with a centrist government and told the colonels to go for it, creating a huge, inexcusably terrifying mess that other people had to live with. Gregory Pappas in the Pappas Post says of the junta, the US supported the military dictatorship and turned a blind eye to much of the anti-democratic activity of the regime. When the colonels took over in April 1967, they went after the newspapers, arresting editors who didn't support them. Here's where things get familiar. Greek politicians, including the elected prime minister, were persecuted, jailed, tortured. Parliamentary democracy was suspended. Political parties dissolved. Anyone who had anything to say, who questioned the actions of the regime, was arrested. People weren't allowed to gather outside in groups larger than 4, even at a cafe. I just left a gathering of 6 friends at a coffee shop. We would have been harassed or arrested under this military junta. Civilians were surveilled if more than 4 people gathered inside their own homes. Seriously, this is Greece. What did people do at Easter? We easily had 40-plus people showing up for birthday parties when I was a kid. People were imprisoned, tortured, and exiled based on their political party. Prison camps were built on a few of the islands to house the prisoners, seized, condemned, and sent far from home, where these people would have no contact with anyone who cared about what happened to them. There was little outward resistance from a nation where undercover agents operated freely and citizens were recruited to report on friends and neighbors. Reminiscent of the stories about Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, communist Romania, it was a terrible time for Greece, which is why I'd expect more American Greeks to take issue with the current American regime, which is totally following the Colonel's playbook. I was a child at the time of the Colonel's coup, so I'm showing my age. My uncle, his wife, and sister-in-law and her son escaped to the U.S. in the early 70s. I remember the adults talking about the horrors, the hunger, the violence, the fear. And my uncle's wife, a Romanian Greek, talking about the same terrors of the communist government there before she escaped to Greece, from the frying pan into the fire. I learned then, from listening to them, that fascism and communism are two sides of the same coin. All the power lies with the leadership. The average person suffers. If dissent is outlawed, there's something seriously wrong with your system of government. Spiro Agnew, the American vice president in 1969, and the son of a Greek immigrant father, famously said of the junta, "It was the best thing to happen to Greece since Pericles ruled Athens." Pericles, the statesman who saw the Parthenon built. Everyday Greeks were suffering, their every move watched and judged, their property taken by millionaire supporters of the junta. Really, the best thing. He had it good here in the U.S. and plenty of freedom to spout idiocy. A few years later, of course, he resigned over a big corruption scandal. One of the first things the regime did after cowing the newspapers was to target universities. An educated public is a dangerous public. Education reform in post-war Greece had a tremendous impact on the literacy of the country. The vast majority of Greeks by the end of the war were illiterate, and only the elites went to university. Opportunities for middle-class and working-class students grew. An entire generation of young people was receiving a broad education. The colonels needed to shut that down. They began exerting control over the curriculum, watering down some subjects, bolstering others with pro-junta propaganda. There were minor protests against the junta by underground resistance groups, quickly squelched. The real challenge to the junta began not so much with the resistance groups as with university students. Almost 3.5 years into the military dictatorship, on September 19, 1970, 22-year-old geology student Kostas Yoriakis, who was studying in Genoa, Italy, committed suicide. In the center of the city, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he immolated himself. Street cleaners witnessed Yoriakis running through the streets in flames, shouting, "Long live Greece," and "Down with the tyrants." He died 9 hours later. This was the first major public protest against the junta, a violent, horrific stand against it, and it stunned the world. Greek reporter says Yoriakis' death was the first tangible manifestation of the depth of resistance against the junta. He was an inspiration for what came later. The regime actually delayed the return of Yoriakis' remains for 4 months, fearing it would trigger demonstrations. The poor family. By 1973, after 6 years of this extremely repressive government, university students were chafing at the control exerted over every aspect of their lives. The government increasingly interfered with education, particularly in universities, not only by influencing subject matter, but in the hiring of professors and the entire approach to teaching. The regime interfered with student unions, the committees elected by students to help them with academic issues or social issues. The student unions were now led by hand-picked stooges who reported to the state and were guided by on-site commissioners who were no longer educators but retired army officers. The commissioners groomed the chosen student representatives and acted as a control on the student population by reporting any suspicious behavior or attitudes exhibited by students or professors, any one of whom might be arrested as a result. Students had been pushing for years for the return of union elections promised by regime leader Yorgos Papadopoulos. When the elections finally approached, the junta was able to use their own advisors to make sure that its candidates were elected. Instead of being deflated and defeated, students began stepping up their demands for involvement in the direction of their education. Football, soccer for Americans, was now dominant on Greek college campuses ahead of academics. This may be normal in the US, but it was not normal in Greece. A petition circulated demanding reprioritizing academics, and more students began to flock to the cause. Police began harassing students outside of the confines of the campus. Students at Polytechnic University wrote up a list of demands to present to the rector, demanding intellectual freedom. The response was a government decree authorizing the conscription of male students who were believed to be behaving in an anti-national manner. Students opposed the decree and started to stage anti-junta demonstrations. Police began entering university property, beating students as they went. Professors or administrators protesting the incursion into the sanctuary status of the university were also physically attacked. By late January 1973, police began conducting raids near the Athens Polytechnic Institute and were confronted by students. 11 students were arrested and tried for insulting authority and teddy boyism. I had to look that one up. According to the London Museum, teddy boys were part of a British youth subculture in the early 1950s to mid-1960s. Their dress was inspired by turn-of-the-century Edwardian dandies. And if you go online and look at the photos, they just look fabulous. They had a penchant for rock and R&B, and later they were considered rowdies and hooligans by the British administration. Greek youth, almost a decade later, were being called teddy boys. If you look at the way they're dressed like regular 1970s teenagers, t-shirts, blue jeans, long hair. So I don't know what that was about. The students were nonviolent, but they taunted the police. When police were sent to break up a particular student meeting, the students called them fascists, Gestapo, and cover the ears of youngsters, please, bustis and malakas. Crude but effective insults. Pardon me. The cops flipped out and dragged off a number of the students, beating them with truncheons. The February trials of the students turned into a political event, says Kostas Kornetis in his book, Children of the Dictatorship. It generated a great deal of negative publicity for the junta when photos of injured students were introduced as evidence of the regime taking matters too far. These photos shocked the public, who up to then had been shielded from any evidence of the violence of the state. Sympathy for the student resistance grew, and the students were freed without punishment, maybe for fear of raising their profile. Yet 120 male students were told they could no longer defer their military service and were instructed to report to Army headquarters. C.M. Woodhouse, a former official of the British Foreign Office in Greece and the author of The Rise and Fall of the Greek Colonels, states, student resistance to the junta was spontaneous and improvised. It seems each time the regime was taken by surprise, which made the movement more visible and more popular. Civilians began to show open support. As the student movement grew, police began rounding up and arresting those believed to be the leaders. They were beaten and held in solitary confinement. The students remained nonviolent while the police force became increasingly brutal in their physical attacks. On February 21st, 3,000 students barricaded themselves inside the law school building at Athens University for 2 days, boycotting classes and demonstrating. 88 students from the law school had been suddenly forcibly drafted despite the military deferment given to university students. The students barricaded themselves in the law school buildings, as we said, demanding the junta stop drafting students. The protest ended quickly when police stormed the buildings. Many of the students were beaten by police. This act of resistance is seen as the precursor to the Polytechnic Uprising 9 months later, Protesters now shouted, "Down with the junta. This is new." Meanwhile, 3,000 students in Thessaloniki gathered at their university, but a fight broke out between the police and the students, and the demonstration ended. The regime threatened newspapers, forbidding them to cover the student protests. There were more protests in the spring, and the level of brutality increased. Cornetti says the regime started using terror against the students by calling in the military to take over from police. Students were now being tortured, beaten on the soles of their feet with iron rods, tied to their beds, dragged around by their hair. Female students were forced to listen to soldiers making vulgar sexual threats and crude comments about their bodies. They were threatened with rape, and many were raped. Outrage grew. The regime now took a carrot and stick approach. They tortured students, detained them without food, water, or heat. But then suddenly, in the summer of 1973, political prisoners locked in jails on some of the islands were given amnesty. The prisoners credited the students for this sudden show of mercy. In October, all expelled students were allowed to return to the university. So let's be friends now. November 4th, 1973, was the 5-year memorial for former Prime Minister Yorgos Papandreou, who had headed a centrist government until 1965. He was affectionately called Old Man Democracy by the Greek people. 500,000 people attended the memorial, where a brawl broke out between students and police. Unrest was increasing, and somehow film footage of students being viciously beaten made it into the press. On November 8th, students marched in support of their classmates who were arrested. By the morning of November 14th, hundreds of students had gathered in the Polytechnic courtyard to protest conditions in universities. They were joined by hundreds of students from the law school. There were coordinated protests at universities in Patras and Thessaloniki, but it was the protests at the Polytechnic in Athens that bloomed into a full-scale uprising. By 2 p.m., 5,000 students had gathered, and more were joining them. Workers began to enter the university to support the students. High school students made their way in to join the protest. The workers helped the students to create leaflets that they printed in the basement print shop and carried outside to share with passersby. Meanwhile, citizens of Athens flocked to the area, shouting anti-regime and anti-American slogans. You can't blame them. The U.S. got them into this tyrannical mess. The junta claimed the workers were communists, supplying students with weapons. This was discredited later by witnesses, including university professors, and in some cases, the police. The students got down to business, organizing committees for food preparation, for keeping track of events occurring outside of the campus, putting guards at the entrances. Medical students set up a first aid station. Someone brought in a radio transmitter, and the pirate radio station of Polytechnic University began broadcasting with a reach of 300 meters, a little less than a quarter of a mile. Student Maria Damanaki called out over the radio, "Polytechnic here, Polytechnic here. This is the radio station of the free-fighting students of the free-fighting Greeks." Student announcers began to pass on news and encouragement. All Greeks were welcome to join them, they said, and more did. Protests spread through the streets, Exarchia neighborhood surrounding the university. They protested the regime and America and NATO for turning a blind eye. Kornetis reports Mikis Theodorakis' songs played throughout. He was an amazing composer, award-winning, who was a symbol of the resistance. He was jailed by the regime. He was sent to a concentration camp, deported, exiled. I love that they played his music during the uprising. That was a protest in and of itself. American writer Kevin Andrews, who lived in Greece, was riding a trolley past the Polytechnic as the protests spilled onto the streets that evening. Quote, "We could see hundreds and thousands of young people clinging to the iron railings around the Polytechnic buildings, massed behind the railings, massed along the pavements out in front, perched on pillars of the entrance gate. They carried mounted placards, quote, all shouting out the words that nobody had dared speak publicly in Greece, far less shout, for 6.5 years. The police and military announced to the population of Athens that the placards were the work of agents provocateurs and anarchists, because aren't they always? Andrews describes demonstrators carrying armloads of homemade leaflets, pulling off one at a time to lick and stick to car windows, or pushing them through open car windows as cars tried to drive past. Andrews grabbed a notebook to write number 114 to pass out, the number of the final article of the Greek constitution, which stated, "The safeguarding of this constitution is entrusted to the patriotism of the Greek people." The government sent the police to disperse the crowds gathering outside of the university. The students closed the gates and began preparing for a siege. Students were asked to evacuate but refused. By now, the police chief was seeking permission from the rector of the Polytechnic for police to enter the campus. In Greece, there was something similar to an asylum rule regarding universities. The space was sacrosanct, and no police or army could enter the grounds unless first given permission by university authorities. The request was denied. The police and the government insinuated all manner of dangerous behavior was going on inside the university walls, including orgies. But professors and officials at the Polytechnic knew the danger of the students were in if the walls were breached. Andrews took a trolley towards the Polytechnic again on November 15th, but it stopped near the National Museum, a little further away. Police blocked access to the sidewalk in front of the university. Students were chanting bread, education, freedom. People outside spread the chants along. Andrews says he and 4 friends drove to a bakery to buy loaves of bread for the students and dropped them off at the Polytechnic near a side entrance. There are multiple reports from multiple sources of people donating food, medical supplies, and money to the protesting students. Protesters sang the national anthem and announced the continued support of students in Patras and Thessaloniki. Andrews wrote by November 16th, the excitement was growing. Greeks were in an almost festive mood, calling the day Good Friday. Students gave regular updates by Radio Polytechnic, which broadcast 24 hours, and by megaphone. Every update was introduced by the radio station motto, Radio Polytechnic, the station of the free and fighting students, the voice of the free Greeks in their struggle. Passers-by continued to slip students money, food, and now cough drops. The latter because the students had gotten word that tear gas would be used against them. Kornetis describes Greek mamas out in force, many trying to ensure their children were safe. I love it. As a Greek mama myself, I would be running around outside with a jacket in one hand, a container of meat that saw me, daring the cops to even look at my kids. Several protest marches began, one to Syntagma Square, where the Greek parliament sits near the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It was broken up by police. Many of the student protesters then joined their classmates at the Polytechnic, where, Andrews reports, all through the daylight hours, groups of farmers, builders, actors, lawyers paraded before the school with the banners of their trade. The farmers were particularly vocal because 7 months earlier, 9,000 olive trees, practically sacred to the Greek people, pistachio orchards, wheat fields, market gardens, and poultry farms were destroyed when confiscated by the junta for one of their rich banker supporters who wanted the land for expanding his business enterprises. Anticipating police action, some of the demonstrators began creating barricades, garbage cans and crates, empty buses and trolleys. Andrews reported a new poster displayed at the gate. When the people aren't afraid, the tyrant gets frightened. Government agents and police had commandeered a hotel across the street from the Polytechnic. Cameras were now pointed at the campus to record the faces of the activists. But they were noticed, and students began waving strips of metal reflecting the sun into the windows in an attempt to blind the cameras. The students called for a general strike throughout Greece, which didn't happen. By 8 p.m., the police began using tear gas and chasing outside supporters from the site. Students began broadcasting instructions for negating the effects of tear gas using Vaseline around the eyes, avoiding washing the eyes with water, and asking residents to keep bonfires going in the streets. They continued to shout slogans throughout the night. This is Polytechnic. This is Polytechnic. People of Greece, you're hearing the truth now. We are unarmed. Our only weapon is our faith in freedom. But the announcements were now interspersed with pleas for doctors to come and help injured students, some of whom had been shot by snipers. Snipers were now stationed on the roofs of the hotel and other buildings surrounding the Polytechnic. These are unarmed kids. Hospital nurses later testified that by 10 p.m., wounded began arriving, victims of the violence unleashed outside of the Polytechnic. At 11 p.m., according to Woodhouse, a doctor heard a broadcast from the Polytechnic asking for medical help. He raced there and saw 6 or 7 students injured by gunfire. They told him 3 had already died. From testimony gathered later, it was believed at least 40 casualties were shot by snipers, even before the army officially arrived on the scene. It was also reported that 2 doctors tried to get into the Polytechnic, but students wouldn't let them in, fearing they were government agents posing as doctors. At that point, it was believed there were thousands of students inside, not just Polytechnic students, but the high school students and others who'd slipped in before the gates were locked. Tear gas canisters crashed into the buildings. Finally, an ambulance took wounded students out of the side door and drove away, bullets hitting the pavement nearby. Several people outside of the university were shot, according to Andrews, and the streets emptied. A few ambulances were targeted with tear gas as they tried to help injured students. Andrews reported that some of the ambulances beginning to appear were manned by police agents, as the students had feared. These policemen, disguised as doctors, beat the injured before shoving them into the ambulances and driving away. Anyone still outside of the gate was beaten with clubs. Andrews stayed nearby, hiding in a building across the street from the Polytechnic with a group of young people. Even as Army tanks began to approach, he says the students wouldn't believe the soldiers would attack children and young people. But as tank after tank rumbled past, a group of soldiers came at Andrews and the others, beating them with clubs as they ran. A Norwegian tourist was killed, and Andrews claimed that 5 people hiding with him tried one at a time to cross the street to safety, and each was shot in turn. Most were killed. Army tanks were stationed around Athens, and at 2 a.m. on the morning of November 17th, orders went out to end the rebellion. Several tanks approached the campus. One pulled up in front of the central gate, where students and a few journalists sat on the pillars. The students were waving Greek flags and singing the national anthem. The Polytechnic radio announcers, broadcasting through megaphones, asked the soldiers to join them in resisting. Again, they couldn't believe the army would attack unarmed students. A student delegation approached the officers now standing by the campus gate to negotiate surrender. At first, they wanted to evacuate at 6:30 in the morning, quote, in the presence of the Red Cross and of representatives of foreign embassies, according to Cornetis. That was not granted. Students asked for half an hour to clear the campus. They were told they had 15 minutes. One of the Polytechnic radio announcers begged soldiers not to follow orders and hurt their brothers. He recited the Greek national anthem, which was a poem called Hymn to Liberty, written in 1823 during the War for Independence. It was later set to music and adopted as the national anthem. There are many stanzas, so I'll read a translation of the first one from GreekBoston.com. I recognize you by the fearsome sharpness of your sword. I recognize you by your face that violently defines the land. From the bones of the Hellenes arisen, and valiant again as you once were, hail, O hail liberty. Well before the promised 15 minutes had passed, as students began filing out of the main building, the tank stationed in front crashed through the central gate of the Polytechnic Institute and rolled over it, throwing students and a journalist sitting on the pillars of the gate to the ground. Student Pepi Rigopoulos' legs were crushed by the tank. She survived. Students trying to escape through the gap in the fence were beaten with clubs and thrown into police vans. Soldiers and police stormed the buildings, Marines entering carrying bayonets. Radio Polytechnic went dead. In the end, the official death count was 34, but many believe it was much higher. Woodhouse reports 700 to 1,000 were injured. Close to 1,000 were detained by police. Among the dead were at least 2 high school students and a 5-year-old child caught in the crossfire. I'm still trying to understand why any students had to die. That night, President Papadopoulos imposed martial law. Any public demonstrations or gatherings, soccer matches, possession or use of amateur radios, and sheltering anyone not a family member was forbidden. Shootings continued over the next few days. There was a sudden increase in prices that led to hoarding. November 25th, Papadopoulos was overthrown by one of the other colonels, Dimitrios Ioannidis, who was even more of a hardliner. He was also a megalomaniac idiot who spearheaded an intended coup against the leader of the island of Cyprus, planning to put the island nation under Greek control, which triggered a Turkish invasion, resulting in the deaths of many innocent civilians and the permanent partitioning of the island into Greek and Turkish territories, and the problems there continue. After that happened, the rest of the colonels ousted Ioannidis from power and returned Greece to a democracy. It's more complicated than that. And there was an incredible amount of cleaning up, reorganizing, releasing of political prisoners, arresting of regime flunkies. There was even a fight over who actually destroyed the Polytechnic campus. Demonstrators were accused of causing damage deliberately, but the thousands of dollars of damage was finally determined to be caused by the tank crashing through the gate and the subsequent military assault. Workers that had stood by the students were accused of being anarchists, but the testimony of many witnesses proved that the only troublemakers on the scene were agents of the government. Free elections took place on November 17, 1974, the 1-year anniversary of the uprising. Many of the student leaders went on to be members of the next generation of democratically elected officials in Greek government. November 17th is remembered for those who died and for the uprising that signaled the coming dismantling of the military regime. The Polytechnic Uprising is commemorated and celebrated annually by university schools, politicians, labor unions, everybody. There are marches and there's protests. In Thessaloniki, the marches end at the U.S. consulate. At the head of the march through central Athens, students carry the blood-stained Greek flag that flew at the Polytechnic on November 17, 1973. The march ends at the U.S. Embassy, which the American International Journal states is to declare the Greek people's will to shake off foreign interference. Bravo. There is a ceremonial wreath laying at the site of the front gate of the Polytechnic, where citizens leave carnations at a monument by sculptor Memos Makris. The bronze head of a young man lying in the Polytechnic courtyard is dedicated to the students of the uprising. It lies on the iron railings of the main gate that was smashed in by the tank. A list of the names of the students who died during the uprising is read, along with the names of those who died fighting the dictatorship. Struggles persist. Sometimes those cousins in chaos, anarchists, ultra-right-wing nationalists, or communists cause disruptions. One thing that really interested me was the different ways news sources interpreted the events of November 17, 1973. At the time, Neos Kosmos, a Greek-Australian national paper, reported this: there is a state of siege throughout the country. The airports are closed. The fascists have bloodied the capital. A wave of arrests. The detention centers are full. Of the students, they reported, despite the cold-blooded killings and intensified repression, despite the occupation of Athens by large mechanized military and police forces, the students continued to resist. Meanwhile, Aussie dock workers' unions, according to Neos Kosmos, began to tie up Greek ships arriving in Melbourne in protest at the murder of Greek patriots by Papadopoulos' fascist regime. Go Aussies! Associated Press photojournalist Aristotelis Sarikostas and Dutch cameraman Albert Karan recorded everything that happened, proving everything the junta had tried to deny. We already know what journalist Andrews reported. Now, for the New York Times. First, the headline for November 17th is, Troops in Athens Move on Campus to Quell Protest. The reporter states, after midnight, Army tanks and armored personnel carriers were called to dislodge students and workers barricaded in the Athens Polytechnic University. The reporter goes on to say the Army succeeded in return to base. What? On November 18th, the New York Times reported, Greek troops using a tank crashed through the iron gates of the Athens Polytechnic University early today to help police dislodge some 2,000 students who had seized the campus and demanded the overthrow of the government. The reporter also says the tanks fired volleys of machine gun blanks to disperse demonstrators throughout the city. We have it on good authority blanks were not involved in the Army's action against the demonstrators. The reporter does tell us helicopters directed ground troops to trouble spots, which I didn't see written anywhere else, and it is terrifying. He then reports 4 people were killed. Also, 200 building workers joined the protest, like people who worked in the building. Quote, the most militant leftists in Athens. The New York Times sounds like a mouthpiece for the regime. Reporting was different in Ioannidis' obituary in 2010 when the fascist was called a fascist, but the student uprising wasn't mentioned. I tried to find headlines and articles from the Greek American papers. I know they're there. Those we found had huge headlines about the Polytechnic, but they were only in Greek, and as I've said, my Greek isn't good enough to feel comfortable with an accurate translation. There are so many more stories to tell about the 4 days of the uprising. If anyone has stories from family members, please send them and we'll share them. In the meantime, our next episode will be an interview with Sean Bryan, who as a 19-year-old visiting Greece in November 1973, witnessed students protesting and the violence of the regime in response. We have a full list of sources on the website if you're interested in finding out more about the Colonel's coup. There is a novel written by Natalie Bokopoulos, The Green Shore, if you want a softer approach to reading about the experiences of the Greek people during the Colonel's coup. I highly recommend it. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Diotis Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Thank you, Eduardo Gill, for help tracking down sources. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. We're on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at Greek_like_me. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. See you next time. Yes.